probably to kickstart the panel session, so we almost have close to 45 minutes to 1 hour for this session. So we'll start the panel discussion. So probably we'll address the first question to Minister for Finance. Sir, what is there in the coming budget which is planned for June? Anything that we need to be aware of? We all know that we are just past one of the serious disasters this country ever faced, Cyclone Winston, and we are getting ready to come back. So your thoughts on that one, sir?
Okay, thank you. I'd love to be able to tell you, but no, I think what is really critical though, and I think that has been fundamental to the growth rates that we've had, the sustained growth rates I should say, is there needs to be consistency in policy. So the fundamentals should not change, and even the fundamentals should not change in the wake of Cyclone Winston. But what we do need to do, and this is essentially, as I was saying in my address, that we need to get a lot of ideas, because as you would have seen in the press, we have a lot of multilateral agencies, development banks wanting to lend us money. It's great, but we obviously don't want to take all the money all at once. We need to be able to, have them over a period of time, but more importantly, to be able to ensure that whatever capital investment we make, or whatever new policies we put in place, must have a multiplier effect in the economy. Generally, from any type of catastrophe, when you have a huge rebuild program, it does lead to growth rates. It has a spurt, it has a surge of growth rate. But the idea is to ensure that it is sustained, and the idea is to ensure that when you do actually spend that money, it has a long-term effect. So whether it is, for example, opening up a potential of a particular area in Fiji that may, very simple, open up a particular village or particular area to new markets. In the same way, it's a very sort of traditional way of viewing, say, relocation of villages. It should not only be the question of, well, let's get the village relocated to a higher ground, but we should be looking at, when we relocate to the village, what will be the source of livelihood? Are we going to give them the capacity to run a prawn farm? Should they have a crab farm? Whatever is suitable for that particular area. So they have a source of livelihood, a source of sustained livelihood. So that's the type of critical thinking we must have. As we said, for example, to some of the people from the Ministry of Fisheries about 2 years ago, this whole idea of setting up ice plants, in remote areas. Great, fantastic idea. But have you used the technology? They say, let's put our ice plant on this particular island. And how will the ice plant run? Oh, it will run by a diesel generator. How will you get the fuel there? How much fuel can you store there on that island? When it runs out, what is the logistics of who's going to supply the fuel? So we've had in the past, 10 years ago, some of the islands, they had ice plants, but half the time it did not run. Because nobody actually thought beyond the just the simple infrastructure building of the ice plant, but nobody thought about logistics, about how to get the diesel there. It may look good, you have a minister that comes and cuts the ribbon and everybody celebrates, yippee, your ice plant. But have you been down there 3 years later and see what's the uptime of the ice plant? So these are the kind of things we need to look at. We need to strategize in terms of our development plans. But as far as the fundamentals are concerned, there will be a maintenance of the policy consistency, and that is very, very critical.
We really appreciate your presentation. There's one advice from you. Fiji has too many old schoolboys boat membership. Just to clarify you that, we got a lot of company boats, which consist of men, probably old. That's why they say old schoolboys. From your perspective, how we get young as well as women into it? I know from where the question coming, I'll tell you later. But if you can advise us how we get young people as well as women into these boats.
Thank you for the question, whoever that came from. Look, this is not a challenge that's unique to Fiji. This is So in Australia, this is a true statistic, there are more directors, male directors called Peter, on the boards of ASX 100 companies, so our top 100 companies in Australia, than there are women. There are more directors called Peter than there are women on boards in Australia. So we face the same challenge. We're with you. We're all trying to nut this one out. I think a couple of thoughts. The first thing is it amazes me how much of a difference it makes when you have a CEO and a chair or a selection committee who actively put it on their agenda that they're going to seek different sorts of candidates when vacancies come up. It amazes me and I've seen it over and over again. I'm fortunate to serve on a number of boards in Australia where the chairman continually will say, okay, I want an equal number of male and female candidates for our vacancy. I want to see the resumes or the applications of a split. So that's an important role that a chair or a leader can play in and of themselves. I think the second thing in terms of thinking through how do you create roles and opportunities for young people, it was mentioned earlier the importance of mentoring. Mentoring is a really exciting topic in this day and age because reverse mentoring is so powerful too. If you're creating a mentoring relationship where you're going to teach a young person about governance or about how to operate effectively on committees, at the same time, they can be giving you all this advice on how to digitally take the company forward, or providing their lens on how things could be done differently within the business. So thinking about how you actively create a structure where you go and identify up-and-coming young talent in Fiji, and you say, hey, we want our hands on them, we don't want another company getting them. How do we create a mentoring program where we match all of our board to an aspiring young leader within Fiji and create that sort of reverse mentoring relationship? Not only so you're developing potential pool of directors, but your company's actually benefiting right then and there, and certainly you're helping develop the young people too. So in a couple of instances in Australia, on one of the big theatres in Melbourne, I serve on what they call a shadow board. So they've created a board that shadows the main board of directors. We're all under the age of, I think, 33. And we get together, we come to the strategy day with the board, we have all the input in, we've got a big focus on how we grow their youth membership and drive better digital engagement, but we're also learning and being in that relationship as well. So I think there's great opportunities, firstly, to think about how you actively make sure it's a diverse candidate pool, how you set up mentoring sorts of structures, or some kind of relationship where you have an understudy board, so to speak, who then have the opportunity to ascend onto your major board, for example. That being said, I think you can find the talent right here, right now. I'd put money on it that there are young entrepreneurs and leaders in Fiji under the age of 35 who you could put on your boards of your organisations right now. So if you don't know them, then the onus is absolutely on you to go and find them and ensure that that talented individual is coming into your company and organisation and not going somewhere else.
Thank you, Oli.
I just wanted to make a comment on that, and I think it's important to get a diversity of thought, but I think in terms of appointments, what is really critical, in order not to sort of in any way discredit the idea of inclusion, is that there must be a fundamental threshold that everybody must pass. So it must be merit-based. And I think we cannot compromise the idea of ensuring that everybody meets the fundamental requirement. And then you can get the sort of diversity of, of people, etc. But the merit-based system is very, very critical. In the AG/Solicitor General's chambers, we had very few females. There was, for years, for decades, there was no clear criteria as to how people were selected as lawyers into the AG's office. We put in place a few years ago, just a few years ago, a very transparent manner in which people would be appointed. We had minimum GPA requirements and what they were asked in the interviews, etc. The past two intakes we've had have all been people below 25, some about 26. In the last intake, out of 7 candidates, 7 people who were actually taken in, 5 were females. In the intake before that, out of the 9, 7 were females. They weren't selected because they were females. They were chosen because they actually met the threshold and they did the best. So all those people who have been appointed can actually safely say that we are there on our own merit, and I think that is very, very critical. The other point I'd like to also make is that if you look at the average age of board appointments now in Fiji, in particular of SOEs, compared to even, 7 years ago, you'd find that the average age has in fact come down quite significantly. In the same way we have the representation. I think we've never in our history have we had four permanent secretaries, females, at the same time. Our Speaker to Parliament, our Secretary General to Parliament, our Secretary to Cabinet are all simultaneously females. Now all of those people have been appointed there on their own merit. But I think it's the idea or the ability to look outside the box and say that many roles that were traditionally filled by males can equally be done by females. I think we've never had a female as a permanent secretary for finance. Because finance and some of the other sort of ministries were generally seen the domain of males. So now if you have an open mind, say, okay, we'll open the field to everybody else without these prejudices, people will get appointed on merit.
Thank you, sir. So the next question goes to Augustine.
That's a very difficult question, Farid. If you can give us the land on the other side, okay, you'll see the second pearl. That's my answer. I think we are working on a concept development to develop pearl. And we just trying to sort out the caveats on the other side. So once we do that, you will see the replicate of the pearl on the other side of the land. Thank you.
And the question also goes a little bit further, asking, why it's only you? How about other landowning units in PNG? Can't they invest in Fiji?
I think there are different types. Like you have the provident funds, which are different. They are super funds. But with the landowners, you have different structures. We look after the oil and mining in terms of the equity participant. But there are others in the constructions, all this, but they are more freelance. So they are involved in the small areas, in the other investments here. But we represent the bigger group of PNG.
How the millennials, the new generation, how they act, work and enjoy life. And what do you think if this sort of a person becomes a CEO?
I actually know a lot of them that are CEOs already. So that's the interesting thing. I think, and it speaks to kind of what we need to be thinking about in terms of our education and training systems, because what we want to be ensuring with this next generation, particularly given what I talked about with how work's changing and how they're going to have to be more enterprising, whether or not they're entrepreneurs in the traditional sense of the way that we might have thought about the word, they're going to have to be enterprising in how they create the opportunity and find the economic opportunity to be able to support themselves. So I think without a doubt, like I know a huge number of young people right across the world, might I add, who are under the age of 30 and who are running companies. We can sometimes forget that Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook and the founders of most of the major sort of unicorn companies and all of the major sort of successes out of the valley in the last 10, 15 years have been under the age of 30. So what we're seeing is the successful CEOs, to begin with, they have a great idea. They see an opportunity because there's an insight or a different way the world works, or they see an opportunity that hasn't been captured previously. And people like Mark Zuckerberg have been really effective at ensuring that they get a great mix of people around them. You know, his workforce, a lot of his senior leadership team are 2 decades older than him. He's brought in wisdom and experience alongside having a really young workforce who continue to keep those new ideas and that digital agenda running. So I don't think we need to worry about this generation being CEOs. I think we need to be making sure that we're creating the conditions in Fiji so that they want to be CEOs here and they want to be creating businesses and employing people, and that you're a competitive economy that keeps them here and builds the skills in them so they can be really effective, because that's what we're going to need. We're going to need that next generation worth of small business owners.
Thank you, Holly. Minister, what Institute of Accountants can do to the government and the people of Fiji? He's a very young accountant is asking this question.
No, I think it's a very good question, and as I was saying earlier on, that you don't actually have to do necessarily a accounting thing to be able to contribute just because you're an accountant. I mean, some accountants are great philosophers. It's a rarity, but you know, they're great philosophers. They can also make contribution in the way not many lawyers can probably talk about ethics. I mean, you know, we can argue about that. But I think the issue is that as a young person with intellect, with the ability to think, you can make a contribution in many different ways. We've had individuals who actually come up to us and rung us up and said, look, you know, what can I do? I want to do something. So in the same way, for example, when we had Cyclone Winston, I had, and I think the person is in the room, actually it was Ajay, who talked about how, you know, he's a pharmacist, and he wanted to talk and help the Commissioner Weston's office in terms of logistics, because he thought that, you know, private companies, people who manage companies, may actually be very good in logistics, and maybe some civil servants aren't good in logistics. So you can also help in that respect. It doesn't have to be something that's simply confined to your area of profession.
Thank you, sir. Another question for the organizers is, where will the cocktail be held? So, relax. We have another 6 hours for the cocktail. So again, it comes to Augustine. You mentioned about your investment in the Pacific, but still you spoke only about the South Pacific, but you didn't cover all the countries. Have you ever looked at Northern Pacific, like Marshall Islands, Palau, FSM?
At the moment, we are comfortable where we are. You know, you look at different countries, the economics are different, the scale. So between Fiji, Solomons, Vanuatu, and Samoa, I think this consists of their major economies. So it's too far. Thank you.
Short and sweet, love it.
Holly, it's for you. I'm a young accountant, just got 2 kids, 5 and 4. So yeah, it shows that you're a good accountant. And what is the message you are giving me when these kids become big?
What was the question?
So I'm a young accountant, the kid is 2 kids, 5 and 4 years old.
Yeah.
When these kids become big, how I should look after them in terms of...
I'm going to be... not having kids myself, I feel like it's very brave to step into giving parenting advice. You're very wary of doing that. I think... oh gosh. I think the most important thing that you can be doing with your young kids at home is creating that curiosity for lifelong learning. I think one of the most important things we need to do for this younger generation coming through to ensure they're successful is make sure that they have a love of learning and they're prepared to try things, take risks, pick themselves up and go again. And the reason I say that is because the studies suggest that this is a generation who are going to have 14 careers across the course of their lifetime. It's just massive. I swear 5-6 years ago it was only 8, so I don't know how we've added 6 more in the last 5 years. But it speaks to that pace of change in the economy, and one of the things that means is that we're going to need a generation who can study in something, then see the transferable skills and opportunity, put themselves in a new opportunity, learn new skills, you know, have a bit of a career there, jump somewhere else. So I think as a parent, the best thing that you can be doing is encouraging that learning to be as broad as it possibly can. And given, again, where you think the world is going, encouraging particularly maths and science type learning, because we know so many of the jobs ahead will be relying in some way, shape or form on technology, and we'll need them to be able to engage and understand. It doesn't mean everyone has to code, but they will need to understand how it works and be able to manage coders, or be able to engage with technology in that sort of way themselves. So far from me to give parenting advice, it would purely just be to foster that love of learning. I think that'll be really important.
Thank you, Holly. So all the debaters we have carefully selected, all of them got at least 2 kids. So please tomorrow at 11:30, don't miss that. And all of them.
Can I share the scariest statistic on screen technology as fuel for this debate that's coming tomorrow? Is that okay?
Yeah.
So the scariest stat I've come across is that the average 18-year-old male in the United States, so by the time a kid reaches 18, they will have spent 10,000 hours gaming. Now put that in perspective, that is the same number of hours they will have spent at school. So that is really interesting to think about, the volume of screen technology and particularly gaming and what that means. So let the debate begin.
Good point.
I think it's encouraging to see that you seek solution from people in terms of issues out there. But we always face the barriers. Okay, you said leave politics alone, but we all know that the politics does play a lot of in terms of those barriers, bringing those solutions forward. These barriers could be from anything from education, training, business, private, government, but the frustration still stays there that cannot be brought forward because of the interference of politics within that going forward. And the second question is, with the younger generation, they're educated, they want to work, but these barriers do not allow them to go forward. How do we break that barrier? We say 2025, that's a long time. This generation will reach 40 plus. Where is the threshold that says we can do that? Or change that to say we will do it, and give some sort of solution to the providers that they can actually move this forward. I'm a returning Fiji citizen setting up business in Fiji. I find the biggest frustration is that finding the solution, putting the solution in is not easy. So in order to time that, my question back to a solution, say, I asked the minister, is it easier to set up a commissioner in terms of innovation, that where people are able to put solutions and those solutions can be picked up by bodies in government or others to move this forward in a quicker way to make Fiji better?
Thank you, sir.
To be frank, I find the question very general. I don't know what specifically you're talking about where politics has stopped you from being able to provide solutions. So if you gave me an example, then I can answer your question. I most certainly have not met you. We don't have any restrictions in respect of anybody coming to see us if they have solutions. And I think the fact that you have the ability now, people to be able to approach government on many things. You know, if you're talking about, you may have spoken to some civil servant that may not necessarily have taken up the idea, that may well be the case. I mean, we ourselves actually struggle at times with the manner in which the civil service approaches public issues. There are manner in which, for example, very basic things like answering telephone calls to being able to, accept new ideas. And the ability to understand that as a public servant, you are actually a servant of the public. That unfortunately is obviously something that has, not been engendered for decades. It was perhaps there, it went out the window in 87, many people would argue. But the point is this, that we now have a reform agenda. This is why, for example, we've got the World Bank coming in, carrying out various assessments of different ministries. I'll give you a classic example. We've had now a practice in Fiji where doctors are deemed to be good administrators of hospitals, or even good administrators. And as we know, that they may not necessarily, just because you're a good doctor, it doesn't make you a good administrator. A good administrator is somebody who has got the necessary skill sets in the training. And we find that a lot of the hospitals are actually run by doctors. In the same way, just because somebody is a accountant, it does not mean that they will make a good doctor, conversely. So I think it's those kind of areas, but please, I'm quite happy to take some specific, if you have examples, and to address that. But we are obviously quite open to new ideas and new solutions. please feel free to write to us. In respect of the second question, I could not quite understand what you were saying, how do you get young people on board? I couldn't understand that.
I was more directed to the fact that you have young generation that can and are willing to move forward, but the barriers are there that cannot be moved for them. There could be, prejudice within the private sector, the government sector, the people, or the business in general. And to move them into those areas, as you say, they have solutions, most people know, but the barriers still exist. How do we open those barriers?
Speaking and this is a really interesting one, because the thing that we found in the G20 work in particular was, as I was saying, all the countries we were working with had 2 to 3 times the youth unemployment rate. And we had themes of barriers or themes of opportunities that we believed were common to all. And then what we allowed our young people to do was take that and go and have conversations with their leaders that specifically pertain to the opportunities in their country. For example, in Germany, the apprenticeship system and vocational training is a far more effective vehicle for young people into employment than it is in Australia, where we've got challenges with that as an opportunity. In terms of youth in enterprise, there's a very different rate of young people starting businesses in the US to that in Saudi Arabia. So it's important, I think, and I would love to have a conversation with you, and I will put my hand up and say if there's an eagerness to work on this issue amongst the business and the governmental community here, I would love to play whatever part I can in assisting you in that. One of the great things I love doing and my company loves doing is working with governments all around the world in this youth engagement space, seeking to understand what the specific nature of the barriers are so that we can address what they look like. But I think with regards to the opportunities, I'll give some examples of things that are done depending on the nature of the opportunity. So one of the things we've seen done quite well across a lot of the G20 countries now is systems where there's support to place young people in internships in industry in order to help them gain valuable experience and get a foothold into employment. So one of the big barriers we're often seeing is that young people do not have the experience to get the job. And the nods I'm seeing from the young people around the room suggest I might be hitting something on the head there. So what we've seen is that chambers of commerce and business associations will set up, they'll provide some kind of small financial incentive or recognition system for their members that take this up, and they'll provide a pathway for hundreds or thousands of young people into skilled experience every year. In other areas where there's a want for more entrepreneurial type activity, and it sounds like there's a reform agenda, so this may be something you're already looking at, how you create enterprise hubs, how you bring people with ideas together with the people that have the capital or the distribution network to be able to start up a business and get it really running. Incredible success stories across all pockets of the world with regards to creating entrepreneurial hubs and driving new economic activity with young people. So we'd love to talk further. I'm obviously speaking in generalities because I'm not alive to exactly what the barriers you're talking about facing young Fijians is, but would love to have a conversation with you about it.
Thank you, Holly.
Andrew Fairley, to the Attorney General. And thank you, all of you, for terrific presentations. You spoke a little bit about the issue of economic equality and racial equality, but you didn't address this issue, and it's, I guess, an overlay of Holly's comments about gender equality. In Australia recently, a woman was appointed as Australian of the Year who achieved significant notoriety because her son was murdered in a domestic violence incident. And that has changed the discussion, has changed the debate in Australia about the whole issue of gender equity. And it has led in a couple of states now to there being programs in schools, particularly primary schools, about respectful relationships. I guess my question is really built around the fact that this is has been historically a patriarchal society. I wonder whether government is taking a proactive view to try and change the game in terms of gender equity.
I did not talk specifically about racial equality per se. What I'm talking about is citizenship equality. There's a huge difference between citizenship equality and racial equality. I think racial equality is more of a term that's very American. But I think citizenship equality is obviously something that's more pertinent to a modern nation state. Because it does recognize, whilst there's commonality as a citizen, we also at the same time have respect and understand cultural imperative and cultural issues, cultural identity. I think to be able to answer your question specifically, we have to look at the legal framework first. We have a Bill of Rights that's built into our Constitution. Australia doesn't, nor does New Zealand. They don't have a written Constitution. So you have separate Bills of Rights. We have built that into our Constitution. Now, if you look at the equality provisions in our Bill of Rights, Section 26, what we call unfair discrimination, there is now a provision in the unfair discrimination provisions. You cannot discriminate on the basis of culture, ethnicity, etc., etc. But also now, pregnancy, marital status. All of these things weren't included ever previously in our constitutions. Now that essentially means that it gives women or people in that gender space the ability to have further recourse if they are being marginalized from mainstream decision making or employment opportunities because of that particular status of theirs. And I think that is very, very critical. The other issue also is the empowerment of women through commerce or through commercial and financial inclusion. That is very, very important. So we have, at one level, we have this microfinance capacity we've been giving, like, for example, $1,000 grants to people who have a small business or running a sole operator business, whether a person is, wants a new fence for the goat farm, to a lady who may be selling, handicraft at the Outrigger Hotel or sitting outside the Fijian Hotel selling some handicraft. Now, she is not able to make that jump up to the next stage because she does not have the seed capital to go on further, to have more products. So this $1,000 grant helps them. Majority of the people who have received these grants are females. In the same way, we have also issues such as domestic violence. I think that is very critical. I think it is, patriarchal societies are in fact something quite prevalent, not just in developing countries, but also developed worlds. I mean, developing countries and developed countries. Of course, in some areas it's more muted than others, it's a lot more sort of under the skin. In others, it's a lot more in your face. I mean, I would argue that Australia is still very much in patriarchal society, with many more Peters than women in the stock exchange. So you can argue and say, well, it is a patriarchal society. But it's the manner in which we deal with those issues. I'll give you an example. We've got this domestic violence decree that's been put in place just a few years ago. In fact, it was not something that we created. It was drafted back in the 90s. But there was no political will to implement it. We simply took it off the shelf, we tweaked it for the 21st century, and we implemented it. Now, in terms of how is it working, I would argue that it is not 100% working in the sense that some people are perhaps not fully attuned to the provisions in the Act, but the fact it has created an environment where you're now getting people, in particular women, who feel a lot more comfortable in terms of reporting matters, because they believe there is now a proper mechanism to get some form of redress. It also makes a lot of commercial sense, as I've said in many tourism gatherings. Majority of the people in this hotel who are serving you in your restaurant, making your room, cleaning your toilets, are women. If they are being bashed up the night before, what's their level of productivity the next day? So it actually goes down. There's rate of absenteeism. There's obviously not a willingness to come to work. So the notions of patriarchy and the practice of patriarchy, or whatever you may call in terms of domestic violence, is not an issue that's confined only to the government space. It's not only an issue confined to NGOs. It should be an issue that should be pertinent to every single person in this room, even if you're a member of an accounting firm. That should be mainstreamed. And I think that's the point I was trying to make in my speech. Regarding other issues also, you need to mainstream these issues, and the private sector in Fiji has a very pivotal and critical role to play in these areas, but they have been absent from that space. That is what I'm saying.
Just to pick up on the private sector point, because I think that's been an interesting area where we've seen some really positive new developments in Australia. So there are a number of corporations now, including National Australia Bank, who actually have domestic violence policies for their companies, which allow women to confidentially disclose that they've been subject to that sort of violence, to take and access leave for a period, to get all sorts of support from their organisation in order to get them back on their feet, because as has been said, it's not good for society, it's not good for community, it's not good for business. So I think to that point, there is a role that leading companies can play. I'm more than happy to send a list of example policies that have been implemented by companies who've started to take the lead on this issue in Australia, for those who are thinking about how could we do something similar here.
Thank you, Oli. Can you give us an update?
It's very difficult for me to give you an update because it changes every day, unfortunately. So I think as it is now, it's business as usual, and we have a government which in 16 months' time will go through an election, so everybody's in election mood, let me put it this way. And the courts are doing what they're doing, and we, I think everything as it is. So it's very difficult for me to add anything because it changes every now and then, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Mano. Arvind.
Innovation, and I love the word innovation several times this morning. I think in Fiji's case, we are very unique in the sense our priorities may be a lot different from more developed countries or developing countries. In terms of innovation, I think employment is the key. And we talked about technologies such as Uber and Airbnb and so on. How do we, what do we put first? The challenge, I think, is to bring those technologies on board. And I think Fiji is in a very perfect position to actually import these technologies and import these business ideas from abroad. How do we, the challenge is, do we put the legislation first? Do we put policies first? Or do we, like Uber is doing, they're going around the world and saying, influencing government and ministers and the top leaders into bringing about the legislation.
Yeah.
So what comes first, and how can we enable such entrepreneurs or inventors or innovators to enter this sphere? I also represent FNU, Fiji National University, and rather than producing graduates, just for clerks or IT managers or HR managers and so forth, we're now looking at an incubator system where we actually innovate and have debates about inventions, what can be done for Fiji, what can be exported to the region and abroad as well. But the legislation and the policies are lacking. So my question is, how can we challenge or address that, both from Holly and the Minister? Thank you.
Thank you.
I think you'll always have an issue. As you know, technology changes very rapidly. The law does not. So in many instances, you'll find that the law is trying to keep up with the technology. So for example, give you a very simple example. You may have, red light cameras, or you may have a police officer standing with a gun. Now that law is fine. If the officer, tracks you, you're speeding at a particular, more than a particular mileage, then you get tracked. Now then there's technology that comes along and says that you can actually find out where the police officer is standing. So it warns you 5 minutes before or a few minutes before. Now if that's the case, then obviously the investment in those laser guns goes to zero. Because I'll immediately slow down. Once I go past the police officer, I'll move along at a much faster speed. Some countries then have to amend their laws to outlaw that particular technology. That's on the reverse. So it's always keeping up to speed. And there are other areas, for example, you may now have certain applications that's available on your mobile phone that was not envisaged when the law is drafted, it actually could have the potential to do that. So again, it's sort of keeping up with that. So I don't think it's a question of what comes first. I think it's a question of having a regulated environment that is conducive to the innovation environment. Now, if particular innovators do want to bring in something that's new, that requires a legal framework, and there's a couple of examples that I can give now in Fiji, they did not actually go and talk to the government, whoever was the government of the day, whoever were the legislators of the day, to say, look, we think you're bringing about this, can we get some legal framework around it? But there is, M-Pesa in Fiji was in fact, whilst the idea came from Kenya, the person in Vodafone who did it comes from Lambasa, who actually put it all together. The actual software that was put together. He's somebody from Lambasa, and that's the kind of creativity that we do have.
It's probably a little chicken and the egg as to which one has to come first. I think I'm a huge believer in how do you actually just get the two sides talking. I don't know if it's similar in Fiji, but in Australia we've probably had a period where government and certainly the entrepreneurial community haven't necessarily known each other. Innovation in a policy sense has been a really different conversation to what I would talk about as regarding innovation with other entrepreneurs. We did an interesting thing recently, not long after Prime Minister Turnbull was elected, where we got 100 entrepreneurs. I was fortunate to be a part of this. 100 entrepreneurs in a room with all the leaders, all of our secretaries of department, all of our leaders across education, across employment, you name it. And we put them in a room for a whole day, and we identified 20 top priority areas regarding barriers, to talk to your question, and also opportunities for Australia. And we mixed the groups up of policymakers and entrepreneurs, and we had what we called a policy hack. So we had a whole day of these leaders in conversation with one another regarding how do we remove barriers and how do we position to seize opportunities. So we talked about everything from how do we improve entrepreneurial education for our young Australians, through to what changes do we need in the tax system to better incentivise Australian companies to start and to stay here and scale. So I think thinking about how you can facilitate that sort of meaningful conversation and exchange, don't get me wrong, we've now got to move that into implementation. But what we did see is the government pick up a number of the ideas that were discussed at that forum in their major innovation announcement about 2 months later. So it's a useful thing to think about the dialogue. I think it's fantastic at a university level you're leading this whole piece around incubation. I think we need to think about, to your point around policy, I think it's a similar sense in what we judge and benchmark our universities on. Traditionally that's been around how many academic papers we can get published and the calibre of the journals that they can be in. What we're seeing now is that's not necessarily translating at all into student outcomes, employment opportunities or entrepreneurial activity. So I think it would be great to think about how we could have a metric around how many businesses were incubated in your university and make that one of the things we're actually giving out funding around, and we're benchmarking universities on. To your point, I think you're absolutely right. The ecosystem needs to support that sort of move, and there should be a conversation at a university standards and funding level around how we don't move away from academic research, that's very important, but how we create a second stream that's better positioned to drive innovation in Fiji.
I'm sorry, I don't have a Vodafone, so I can't text 473. Apologies, next time we'll sort that out. But the question goes to the Minister. Minister, we want to be the brightest and the most innovative accountants in this country. Our act is old. We are about to change. Please give us some advice. What should be included in the new act for Fiji Institute of Accountants? But please, text to 473, yeah? This is my office phone.
I'll be very worried if you're getting billed for receiving a text message. I think obviously, we do need the input from the accountants. But just to use what we did with the legal profession in terms of the changes that were made to the legal framework, there's some slightly different issues, but I think there's some certain fundamentals that have a cross-cutting application. One of them, of course, is the ability to, have your continuing, what we call in legal profession, continuing legal education. I think you call it something else. That I think is something that needs to be ingrained because you need to continuously increase your knowledge base, be aware of what is happening, the changes that's taking place in your profession, and that needs to be enforced. properly. Not just simply coming to some conference and having a few drinks and just signing up and say, I've got my 10 points or 20 points. And I think that's what happens in some of the other areas. The other issue, of course, is the level of accountability. People are becoming a lot more acutely aware of their rights as users of your service. And in order to build confidence in your profession and indeed to, in a way, elevate your profession, you need to have some very transparent rules regarding a complaints mechanism. In Fiji, in the Fiji Law Society, when they used to essentially control the issuing of practicing certificates and also in terms of complaint mechanism, there's something like in excess of 300 complaints that were outstanding by individual clients. Now, a lot of these complaints had in fact been languishing for years. The other problem is that the people who actually dealt with the complaints were the very lawyers themselves. That is a fundamental problem. So that's why Independent Legal Services Commission was created, a legal practitioners unit was created to be able to give individual members of our society the confidence that if they lodge a complaint, the complaint will be assessed and in fact judged or arbitrated, whatever it may be, through an independent process, not through a peer review. I understand you still have a peer review in terms of your complaint mechanism, and that would perhaps one area that needs to be looked at. I'm not necessarily suggesting that we need to create another tribunal or another body. It may well be you could do it within the same domain. In the same way, I'll tell you this is a side issue. We are at the moment working with Asian Development Bank to create a multi-sectorial regulator. So we have at the moment Telecommunications Authority of Fiji that deals with telecom regulations and the implementation, the licensing, etc. But the regulation of electricity and power still sits with the FEA, which is obviously not a good space to be in because they're also the provider of electricity. So the regulatory arm of that must come out. And it must sit with an independent regulator. What we have suggested to ADB, because we're a small economy, rather than having a regulator for energy or electricity, we should have a multi-sector regulator that could look after telecommunications, look after electricity, look after water. So you build the economies of scale, you also have specialization in terms of economists that could work for them, etc. So in the same way, I think there is a space, and this is obviously subject to discussions with everybody, where we could have a independent complaint mechanism for professionals in Fiji, not just accountants, not just lawyers, but also engineers. We need to lift up the game in terms of accountability. The third point I think that is also important in Fiji is that you don't allow at the moment accountants to advertise. It's interesting, we amended the laws for lawyers. Lawyers can advertise, and I was expecting a flurry of activity on television, people saying, I'll get your compensation claim, please, come to me. But nobody's done that. Somebody needs to make the first step. But I think the accounting profession needs to move away from it. You should be able to advertise for your own, your services. You should be able to sponsor events, individual firms, they do it overseas. There should not be any restriction. And that will, I think, allow a lot more space, and rather than trying to in a way, there's a bit of hypocrisy going on. We know that certain firms do, support certain events. You may do it in a roundabout way, but let's do it in a very transparent fashion. They're probably the three key things that I could think about. Thanks.
Fiji Institute of Accountants got a separate clause, separate subcommittees for this purpose. So we have an investigation committee comprising of members of the council, few of them, and the president is not part of that. So when a complaint comes to that investigation committee, the committee goes through. If there is a person who got a conflict with that complaint, he has to excuse himself. The committee goes through that. It also includes one or two outsiders who are the members but not part of the committee council. They go through that. If there is a disciplinary issue, they pass on to another committee which is a totally different membership. It normally includes the president and again few others. And they go through the outcome of the investigation committee, whether there is a need for a disciplinary action. If it is so, we take it. And I just want to keep it in public space right now. We have right now around 5 investigation cases we are going through. When I started 12 months ago, there was none, but we have been keep on through the public domain. We have been saying, if there is one, please come forward. We need to know what, we'll handle it. But out of the 4, all we are dealing it. There was one disciplinary action to be taken, that also we have done. So I just want to put in place, we are very transparent and accountable, and if there is some conflict issues, there are times the person affected or there is a person who is in conflict, declare that and get out of that. So that is just want to be clear on that. Thank you, sir, for that point. And there is another one here, before I think I go. This is a technical issue. I think this person says, I think is the CEO of Stock Exchange says that she can't see me because I'm too short, so it's okay, I'm here. So she want to ask the questions. Lati, please go ahead.
I do congratulate all three of you for the presentations, the Honourable Acting Prime Minister, your good self, and Mr. Mano. I think it appealed a lot to us millennials because you're cutting three topics that are really quite close to us. There's investment, of course, our involvement in the private sector, but also technology. My question really is on, while I do appreciate the comment that the private sector ought to prepare itself for us, as young people being the big part of the economic base, a lot of us millennials aren't really thinking anymore about working for the man or for an institution or for an entity. What we're actually thinking about is starting our own businesses. And one of the challenges that we face is, aside from the ability to be given an incubation center to innovate, etc., most of us have the idea. The problem is access to finance. And that really is the center of my question right across the board. So to the Honourable Acting Prime Minister, my question is, we want to start, these new startup businesses. The banks won't touch us at times, and if, good for you, your parents actually know the bankers, and you could get some financing. But that's a very small part of the population. So what is the government thinking about as we chart the way forward to 2025? With respect to providing alternative sources of finance for us young people, for women, seed capital for innovation, and we're not talking about small grants, but actual, 12 months, 24 months working capital for a great technological idea. And that would be probably for the Acting Prime Minister, but for Holly, I have a very short concentration span, so perhaps with your experience, one or two things, alternative access to finance that Fiji could look at for early startup, particularly for young people. And Mr. Mano, my question for you is, MRDC, great return on income from some of your investments, but you represent land-owning units or resource owners, and a population, I'm willing to bet, bottom dollar, that a big chunk of your population or your resource holders are actually young people. So out of your return on income at MRDC, what are you doing, if you can offer your example, to take some of your ROI and actually pump it back into your resource owners to start their own businesses, in particular, young people and women? Thank you.
That's a very good question. In the petroleum sector, we have what we call, we have three different trusts. You've got 40% that goes directly to the landowners for distribution. And then you have the other 30% called Community Infrastructure Trust that goes to schools, airports, all of this. And then the other 30% is called the Future Generation Trust. That is the one that we use for investments outside. So what we are doing now is, because bulk of the resource development in Papua New Guinea comes in some of the most isolated part of the community. So what we do is we try to build all those infrastructure like schools, airports, and all the elite, like it's very difficult. So those who can make it to the primary school, high schools, we sponsor all of them in all the universities, schools, all of those. And in terms of small business, with our Community Infrastructure Trust, that's where we try to identify all these projects, viable small business, and try to assist all these landowners in doing all of those. And not only that, in terms of some of the contracts in major mining and petroleum projects, we also subsidize some of those business in terms of assisting them to do all the service contracts in their projects. So that's what we've done in a small way in MRDC. Thank you.
Firstly, thank you for that question, and I love your passion as a millennial CEO as well. I think brilliant to see that energy and enthusiasm, not just for your own business, but for further opportunities for other Fijians. And I actually co-chair the United Nations Coalition of Young Women Entrepreneurs, and I'd love to have a conversation with you about getting involved in that, because access to finance is one of the big challenges, particularly for young female entrepreneurs, that we're looking at how we improve. To speak to a couple of things that I think are exciting levers or areas that can be looked at for that. One that blows my mind was when you look at government procurement around the world, there's $51 trillion in government procurement annually. And what we see is that female entrepreneurs currently, this is on the World Bank data that's out there, access about 1% of that. So female-led businesses are responsible for 1% of the businesses servicing government procurement. So I think there is enormous opportunity in how we look at, and Kenya have a really interesting working model of how they're doing this, providing access to specifically young people, women entrepreneurs, and people with disabilities, and basically carving out a particular component. In their instance, I believe it's 20% at the moment on the pilot model they're running, 20% of their procurement for businesses run by those individuals, which gives you an enormous opportunity to take contracts on that you wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity for, and oftentimes get early injection capital and funding into the development of your product, a distribution channel, you name it. So I think that's an interesting area. I can't speak to exactly what's happening at the moment in incubation space and the nature of capital investment. I'll leave that to the Minister to talk about. But obviously, opportunities to incentivise or think about how you create the conditions that are going to encourage Fijian businesses and also business men and women themselves to directly invest in early stage startups. An incentive structure and system there would be a fantastic opportunity as well. And I think one other thing that I've seen, quite recently I travelled to St. Louis in the United States, which is not a city renowned for its innovation. And in fact, a lot of Americans, when I told them I was going there, said, "Why would you go there?" And what's interesting when you get to St. Louis is they made a decision about 6 years ago. A bunch of their leaders got together, very influential mayor, a number of the leaders in industry, and what they did was they decided they would combine in together and create a new hub of activity because they needed to do it for the future of the St. Louis economy. And you go into downtown St. Louis now and they have young people from all around the world who are there running their businesses. In part because they've created a bit of a philanthropic fund to go and find businesses from around the world. They've got Swedish entrepreneurs there, they've got Australian entrepreneurs there, creating their businesses and running them in St. Louis. But I think what it speaks to more than anything is they saw the opportunity to harness what St. Louis did best, which was it sits in the middle of the US, it's got great access to east and west markets. There were some unique advantages they saw in their local community. And they had a group of people who got together and said, we're all going to come in with the capital collectively and we're going to create a structure around this and an economic plan for how we encourage youth enterprise. So I think if it's not here already, the opportunity to lead that from a youth business point of view, to come together with leaders in government and existing owned businesses, think about how capital comes from both of those sources into new enterprise would be a really important part of any plan moving forward.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you. I think you hit the nail on the head. Access to finance actually has been an issue, not just for youth, but also generally for businesses in Fiji. And I think the mainstream banks in Fiji have been very conservative, traditionally speaking. They have been, so not traditionally speaking, but frankly speaking, they have been very traditional in their approach. And I think the requirements of equity have been very high. And I think as a result of that, you saw that institutions like FDB moving away from their mandatory focus and getting into type of mezzanine funding, greenfield funding that really was not their area. You're getting even into tourism. And you even find sort of FNPF now, dipping their toes in those areas that they have done previously. So I think the mainstream banks have a lot to account for in that respect. They have not necessarily been innovative. I know some banks previously, for example, have done Entrepreneur of the Year, and if you win it, you get some type of funding. But it's a one-off. And I think the interest rates have been actually not necessarily been very attractive. So we are concerned about that. You would have seen that in the budget for this year, which was announced last year. We set aside a very modest sum of $300,000 for people who write their own books. I've met a lot of young people who actually are novelists, but they don't have the $5,000 or $6,000 to actually publish their books. We also have that fund set aside for people who want to make their own movies. I'm talking about Fijians, and predominantly these are young people. But to date, last I checked, nobody's taken up that money or even applied for it. But we have been, you may recall, about 2 budgets ago when we had in the pre-budget forum discussion, we did talk about some form of a venture capital vehicle and how we need that to fill in that space. We have an existing structure that goes back to pre-2006, a dormant company that is not trading, and we are currently looking at that, whether that can actually be picked up to run with that type of venture capital finance available. And also companies like Fijian Holdings, and so some of the board members here, they could actually be quite innovative and actually partner in that space also. Because you see, if you look at most of these people, and in fact many studies would show you, even in some of the areas where you've actually had new microfinance initiatives being put in place, even like Bangladesh and various other places, a very high percentage of people actually don't default. So in other words, the defaulters are only about 10 or 15%. So even if you take that risk, that calculated risk, you'll find your rate of return on investment is quite high. And you will actually be injecting a new breed of not just innovators, but people who provide jobs. And I said in my statement that young people need not be job seekers, they need to be job creators. So I think there is that opportunity there, and we need to again think outside the box to provide the space. And you're absolutely right, we need that availability of capital to them. I wanted to say that, this year 2025 was not my year. That was given to me by the Institute of Accountants to say, where would you want to be in 2025? Obviously, many of the things that we stated, we'd like to do it sooner than that. But there are 4 key areas that I wanted to highlight that we'll be focusing on. It may give you some food for thought also for the budget. One, of course, that has been mentioned is ITC, the uptake of ITC. I think there's enormous potential. When Mindpearl came to Fiji a few years ago, they told us 2 things that we weren't necessarily aware of. They said that the reason why they found Fiji attractive was, one, because of the time zone in which we lie, and apparently our accents are neutral. We have neutral accents, apparently. So, they spend millions of dollars, for example, to have Indians change their accents so people in America can understand them. They spend millions of dollars with Filipinos to get them to change their accents. Apparently they don't have to spend that much money for us to be understood by an American or an Australian, even for that matter. So that was attractive, and also the time zone. So we believe there's a lot of potential for that, because overall Fiji has the potential to be a great services center. It's not just ITC, but also medical services. Now, Nalin Patel is here. He's got clients who've been interested in threatening to set up a private hospital in Fiji for a few years now. We really hope that threat comes through. Because, you see, because in Fiji, if any one of us now, any one of us in this room has a heart attack, there is nobody in Fiji that can carry out an open heart surgery. Nobody. That is a tragedy. We have to either go to Australia and New Zealand, or if you have enough time, you go off to India. That's what people are doing. That's what people are doing now. It's a drain on our foreign reserves. It's a drain on our mental and psychological, thought process. We don't necessarily have a national healthcare scheme. We've been dependent on, and we've always thought about it. We have not thought outside the box. The public health system, the rich people can obviously all go off overseas and get their medical checkups done, etc. We need to get out of this space, and we think that if we are able to get a full medical tertiary care facility available in Fiji, it won't be just good for Fijians, for our first priority. They can get top-class facility. It will stop our foreign reserves flowing out. It has enormous potential for medical tourism. Imagine coming and getting a procedure done in Fiji, and you tie it up with a 1-week break in the Mamanudas, a 1-week holiday at the Sheraton. Or you can move into cosmetic surgery, getting a breast implant and then go and suntan it. Whatever the case may be. Enormous potential. A few years ago, when Fiji bought its first MRI machine, about 5 years ago. That in itself is a tragedy when you think about it. We did not have an MRI machine in Fiji. When we bought it, we found a lot of Pacific Islanders were queuing up to come and use the services and pay full amount of money because there's no other MRI machine in any other Pacific Island country. So rather than going to Australia and New Zealand, they chose to come to Fiji to use the MRI machine. So there's enormous potential in that area. So our focus is that, for those of you who've seen the budget last year, we made a very, very generous package to offer to those people who want to invest in the private healthcare system. And we believe that there's a model that we can come up with that will help us to reimburse the cost for those at a particular income level and below. We can look after them, even if it's done through the private health sector. But those people who can afford to pay it, most of you in this room can afford to pay it, you pay on your own. So that's the model we're looking at. Medical coverage for ordinary people is very important. The other one, and I think it's enormous potential for the services sector. We had 3 Japanese companies about 6 years ago that came to see us and say, we want to set up a retirement village. But please have, somebody who can carry out open heart surgery just in case the retiree, has a heart attack. Obviously we couldn't. So that opens up that door. The other area, ladies and gentlemen, that we very much focus on is housing. The rate of home ownership in Fiji is extremely low. I was recently with the Singapore Housing Development Board. The rate of ownership in Singapore is 93%. So we are actually looking at different models. As you know, we've advertised. We're looking at different models where people can have their first home even as a strata title. We changed the law about 3 years ago. So now even with e-tauke land and crown land, you can have strata titling, which makes that land a lot more attractive and a lot more, it appreciates in value. So if you are able to set up a 3-story building with 2-bedroom each flats on each level and buy it for $50,000, $60,000, many of you young people, that would be a first home. We want you to do that. You'd be surprised to know how many Fijians at the moment go to money lenders, because mainstream banks don't lend them money because they don't have collateral, even though they may have a job. So if your grandmother dies and you need to go out to the island, you need an emergency $3,000, you go to the money lender. But if you own your own flat, you can use that as collateral with the bank. So government is setting aside $10,000 grant for those who build their first home and buy their first home at $5,000. The other area that I think is enormous potential is setting up Fiji as a financial hub. Enormous potential. We've got the Papua New Guineans investing, thank you very much. And we want more of them to come to Fiji. Fiji Airways now, ladies and gentlemen, flies to, as we say, to every single continent that rims the Pacific Ocean except South America. We go to North America, we go to North Asia, we go to now Southeast Asia, and we do Australia, New Zealand, and the rest of the Pacific. The only one left is South America. What a great position to be in, and we need to take advantage of that. So things that are very critical is law and order, maintenance of law and order, ensuring that the contracts are enforceable, investment in the judiciary, and to be able to ensure that we are able to take advantage of that financial hub status. We are partnering with Fiji Airways. We've provided $18 million for them to partner with us to fly to Singapore. It is a strategic move. Strategically, it is important because we are able to then say, we are in the center of the Pacific, we are very well connected. Strategically also because, as you have seen in recent times, a number of multinational organizations are actually now basing themselves in Fiji. FAO has just opened up their office for the Pacific in Fiji. What does it mean? It means they hire rental space. Some of you may own that building. It means that they hire buildings or rent buildings, residential homes. They hire people to drive their cars, to work in their homes, etc. It creates employment. And we're able to then position ourselves further from that perspective. So I think ITC, housing, medical, and the financial sector are the 4 key areas that we'll be focusing on. Thank you.